The fundamental purpose and function of this law is to redistribute income and wealth from the middle and the bottom of this country to the top. If you don't understand that, you're not paying attention. You're cutting the profits tax from 35% to somewhere between 20 and 22. A spectacular, huge cut in the tax that corporations have to pay. You've never had anything like, you the average American, never had anything like a cut of nearly 50% suddenly. The rationale is 35% is higher than what's called the titular rate or the formal rate in other countries. That's correct. It's higher at 35% than, say, in many European countries. But that's an irrelevant fact. Why? Because in the United States, unlike those countries, there are a whole set of things called deductions and exemptions. Things that are legally usable by a company to reduce its profits in terms of what is taxed below what the profits are to a taxable profit number. When you adjust it, you get something called the effective tax rate. The effective tax rate is how much taxes they pay as a percentage of their profits before they take away the exemptions and the deductions. Guess what? In the United States, the rate is roughly 26, 27%. It's not 35, it's way lower. And guess what? The average in Europe, 26 and 27 is the same. There is no competitive disadvantage that American corporations face. The next thing, just as important, they are going to give an incentive for companies that have earned profits over the last 20 years, but kept them in an account outside the United States. Not that many years ago, a law was written by these companies which said, if you earn profits abroad, which in these days American companies do a lot of, and you keep the profits in an account overseas, you don't have to pay any profits tax at all. You only have to pay the profits tax if and when you bring the profits back into the United States, called repatriating your profits. So companies that either do a lot of business abroad or can fake the documentation, they don't pay any taxes until they bring it home. And so the Trump administration is saying, in order to get you to bring it home, we're going to give you a special deal. If you bring it home, say in 2018, you will only have to pay, and they're not negotiated that, 5% or maybe 10%. Let's make sure we all understand. This is a reward for not paying taxes for 25 years because you didn't pay, because remember, for 25 years, we're talking trillions. Who are the biggest holders of money abroad? Some of you have seen these stories. Google, Amazon, Apple, all of them. The ones with the social consciousness, who are concerned about the country and its future, are robbing you blind. They don't pay anything. They keep it abroad. By the way, does that mean they don't have the use of the money? Of course not. They put that money into an account in a bank in London. There's two ways they can get that money to make use of it. A, as the owner of that deposit, they can tell the bank in London, this is what I want you to do with it. I want you to buy so many shares of General Motors. I want you to buy so many shares. No problem. None. And if they would like to spend it literally in the United States, here's the easiest way you do it. You go downtown New York into the office of Citibank, and you say to Citibank, I'd like a loan of $50 billion. They take you into a very nice room the minute you talk like that, and you get the loan. You know why? Because you put up collateral. What's the collateral? The money in the London bank is the collateral. So you have use of your money anyway. Bringing that money back to the United States changes nothing. It's just a reward to them that allows them not only to have gotten away with paying the taxes all those years, but to now get rewarded by a special low rate because it sounds good to the American people. We're bringing the money home, and if we bring the money home, it'll be invested here. Folks, if there was a good investment here, they would have been able to do that long ago. They would have borrowed and invested. They're not going to do that. We did this before. Back in 2004, we also gave a tax holiday to companies who brought their profits back. Big promises that would create jobs. None were created. You know what they did with the money when they brought it home? Paid out more dividends to their shareholders, upped the salaries of their CEOs, which they are free to do. If you cut the taxes of a corporation, is that going to produce jobs? The answer is, there's no way for you to know. Because in a free private enterprise system, when you cut the taxes of corporations, they are free to do with the money they don't have to pay taxes on anymore, whatever the hell they want. Are they free to pay it out to shareholders as dividends? Yes! Are they free to pay higher salaries to their chief executives? Yes! Is it likely they'll do that? That's what they've been doing for 30 years. Of course it's likely. Why in the world should they use that money to produce goods and services? They're not going to invest it because the American people can't buy it. And if they do think there's something they can sell to Americans, they're going to produce it in China. So if any of that money creates jobs, it will not be for Americans. So what this is all about is a redistribution of wealth rationalized by catch-as-you-can arguments that they hope people won't think through enough to realize they're being had. Here's the worst one. The Republicans have been busy for the last 25 years undoing the New Deal, undoing the vast collection of social welfare that was enacted in the aftermath of the collapse of the 1930s. And the rationale they did for why they had to cut food stamps or cut welfare, which, by the way, the Democrats did as well as the Republicans, the rationale behind it, let's remember, was America has a deficit. We owe so much money. We can't afford a welfare system. We can't afford to do all these wonderful things. We just can't afford them. Because if we did them, we'd have to borrow the money, and that would increase the deficit of what we owe. We can't do that. That's why Republicans have been using that rationale for 30 years. That's why it's awkward now that the very tax bill they're proposing to cut the taxes on business, they can't figure out how to do that without cutting massively social programs. By the way, to not borrow money to enable them to cut the taxes of corporations, that would mean cutting your Social Security. That would mean taking away your Medicare and Medicaid. Not all of it, but big chunks of it. Which, by the way, they're planning to do next year anyway. But they can't do it right away because you couldn't sell the American people on the following plan. We're going to cut the corporations' taxes a big time, and we're sticking it to your grandma. It doesn't look good. It doesn't sound right. It will make people get unhappy. So they won't do it. Here's what they're going to do. They're going to keep spending roughly what they're spending this year, cut the taxes, and borrow the money instead. By the Republicans' own calculation, they're going to increase the deficit $1.5 trillion over the next 10 years. The party that said that deficit was the worst thing you could have, so bad that you had to cut school lunch programs, is now itself a champion of bigger deficit. This is awkward. It makes mental giants like Ryan really have a hard time explaining to his constituents in Wisconsin how he just changed gear in mid-flight. But here comes the best part. When the government cuts the taxes on corporations and the rich, and then has to borrow the money to maintain what the government's programs are because it's not getting that money from corporations and the rich, it has to borrow the money. Where do you think it goes to get the money it has to borrow? Well, the only people who have money to lend are the companies that are not paying taxes to the same government. They, instead of paying taxes, will now lend it to the government. Now, I ask you, if I was a government official and I came to your house and I said, now I give you a choice. You can either pay your taxes, I take them from you, done, or I borrow the same amount of money from you, pay you interest for each of the next 10 years, and then give it all back to you. How hard a choice do you think that would be? That's what rich people are getting. A big, fat Christmas present. And you're paying for it. You're paying in the form of a deficit, which Ryan is already saying next year will need to be the cuts in the entitlement programs for the mass of people because the deficit is so much bigger that they made. It boggles the mind. It truly does. In a little bit of time left, there is also an estate tax provision here. Under the law today, that is the law before it's changed, the first $11 million that you and your spouse leave to your children is tax-free at the federal level. There is no estate tax on the first $11.5 million. The Republicans and Trump want to either raise the amount you can pass without a tax, or, which many of them want, to eliminate the tax whatsoever. Now let's talk about that briefly. The richest man in America today is Jeffrey Bezos. He's the head of Amazon, and his wealth last week went over $100 billion. Just to give you an idea, there are 54 countries in Africa. Only 4 produce more goods and services in a year than Mr. Bezos owns. Mr. Bezos has more money than the 16 poorest states in the United States produce in a year of the work of their citizens. With the new law, Mr. Bezos will be able to leave the entire $100 billion without a federal tax to his children. This is Pharaoh. This is absurd. It represents the end of any vague effort of the United States to break from the old Europe that it thought it was doing at the time of the American Revolution. You're creating here, and you're cementing into place, a hereditary ruling class. If this goes through, and there's every sign that it will, the only promise really made to the American people that counts from this is that there are going to be real benefits to you next year, the year after. There'll be more jobs, there'll be higher wages. Most of the economics profession thinks nothing of the sort. Nothing of the sort. Now let's suppose the profession is right and the Republicans are wrong. On the one hand, they don't care because they're taking care of the rich people who put them in office and who pay them. And this is the return reward that those rich people get for their contributions. The Republicans are looking great with all the money. That's their political view. But if the mass of people are screwed, then the only real political question in America will be, how do you explain that? Whose fault is it? Where are you going to put your anger that you are not getting government supports at a time when you're not getting any improvement in your life? What's happening here? And then there'll be people like us, and I hope you're with me on this, who will explain it the way I've tried to explain it to you tonight, what's going on and why. But that's not the explanation that Mr. Trump can afford to give, and it's not the explanation that Republicans, because it would be self-destroying for them to say anything like this. They've got to come up with an alternative explanation for why they did what they did and it didn't have the good consequences for everybody else. Why the trickle down didn't happen. And they're going to have to blame somebody else, or else the blame is going to come on them. They're going to find scapegoats. And you already know who they are. They are the immigrants. They are the African Americans. They are the people who aren't white. They are, you fill it in, the intellectuals, the urban people, the northerners. It doesn't really matter. Those people have done it to us because they've got to come up with something. And if the rest of us fight back, then this country dissolves.